Hi, Nutrition 101. In this recording of carbohydrates, we're going to be talking about carbohydrate sources, carbs in health and disease, and also nutritional recommendations. So I'm just coming back to a slide that I had showed a little bit earlier. So remember when we enrich products, it means that we've added something back that was taken out during processing. So if we're looking at carbohydrate sources, we have our whole grains, right? We have our refined grains and refined sugars, which means that we've removed part of that grain. In terms of refined flour, we've removed the bran and the germ and left the endosperm. And when we enrich something, it means that we add back some thiamine, some riboflavin, some niacin, a little bit of iron, and then we fortify products with folate, which means we add above and beyond what was originally in there. So when we're looking at carbohydrate sources in the diet, they might come from fruits and vegetables, they might come from beans, they might come from whole grains or refined grains, and they could come from extractions of any of those things that can be turned into very simple sugars as well, like high fructose corn syrup, sucrose from sugarcane, and then we have our dairy products which contain lactose. So when we're looking at carb sources, they're just really widespread in the food supply. So diabetes, some people are confused about what this means. There are three types of diabetes that we'll talk about. Type 1, which means that our bodies cannot produce insulin. So it typically happens in childhood. It's an autoimmune response where our immune system attacks the pancreas beta cells which produce insulin, and the beta cells are destroyed. Therefore, insulin needs to be taken externally for the lifetime. That could be through a pump or through insulin shots. And the person who has this disease needs to monitor their glucose externally at all times. Type 2 diabetes means that your cells become resistant to insulin. So you still produce insulin, but your cells don't recognize that the blood glucose is high or insulin is there. And so you have both high blood glucose and high insulin levels. Gestational diabetes typically happens in the second trimester of pregnancy, when the mother's cells become resistant to insulin, but the baby cells do not. Therefore, all of the glucose travels to the placenta, and the baby ends up growing bigger and bigger, and the mother ends up feeling sicker and sicker due to that insulin resistance. As you can see here, in all diabetes, no matter what the cause, the diagnosis for that is fasting blood glucose over 126, or feasting blood glucose, so 2 hours after a glucose tolerance test would be over 200 milligrams per deciliter. And you can see there's something called prediabetes, so somebody might be told that they're insulin resistant or have prediabetes if their blood glucose is in that green range. Type 1 and type 2 diabetes have different prevalence depending on the race or ethnicity. So as you can see, non-Hispanic whites have a little bit higher rate of type 1 diabetes, whereas Native Americans have a very high rate of type 2 diabetes. When we look at why we care if blood glucose is high, it can result to a lot of damage to the large blood vessels as well as to the small blood vessels. So a diabetic patient really needs to make sure that they're taking all lifestyle and medical steps necessary in order to keep their blood sugar in the correct range. Damage to the large blood vessels can lead to increased risk of stroke, high blood pressure, increased risk of heart attack, blocked arteries in the legs, which can lead to thrombosis, and reduced blood flow to the feet. That can cause some sores that heal slowly, infections, and then those infections can lead to amputations of the toes, feet, and legs because the glucose just feeds on the microbe growth in the infections, and the infections don't heal well. You can also have some damage to the small blood vessels, such as bleeding in the retina, leading to blindness, excretion of the protein in the urine, and eventual kidney failure, nerve damage that causes numbness and pain, and that can affect balance and increase accidental injuries. So in untreated diabetics, or if carbohydrates are unavailable to cells due to a low-carb diet, fatty acids need to create little acidic bodies called ketones that can be used for energy, but also are excreted in the urine and accumulate in the blood. It's interesting, it's actually in the Atkins diet. Patients, or clients, I guess you'd say, are given little litmus papers to urinate on, and they are considered in ketosis if the litmus paper is more acidic turning. So when we look at this, the purpose of certain diets are to put the body in ketosis. Ketosis creates a really acidic environment, which can be dangerous for the body, but it also makes us not feel hungry. So this is a mechanism that our body has to prevent starvation. However, when you're in ketosis, it means that these extra acidic molecules are being created because the natural process of carbs being available to produce energy isn't happening, which isn't necessarily a good thing. This can cause death in untreated diabetes because in addition to the high ketone levels, there is also high blood glucose, and that accumulation of both in the blood can lead to a diabetic coma or even death. You'll notice that people who are in ketosis, like on a really low carb diet, their breath might smell like nail polish remover, and that's because the ketones have a very similar molecular structure to acetone. So if you start smelling someone that smells like nail polish remover and it's coming from their breath or their sweat, then that probably means they're in ketosis. So lactose intolerance is another carbohydrate-related disorder. Lactose intolerance means a person does not have enough of the enzyme lactase to digest lactose. Therefore, lactose stays intact instead of turning into glucose and galactose as it travels through the GI tract, causing all sorts of traumatic events in the large intestines, including gas, bloating, diarrhea, etc. You can see if you look at this chart around the world, certain parts of the world that historically have never had dairy in their diet have close to 100% lactose intolerance. On the other hand, you might only see 11 to 30% in places like the US or certain places in Asia or Africa where it's much more common to have lactose in the diet through dairy products. And then we have the effects of a high fiber versus a low fiber meal. As you can see on the left here, a high fiber meal is going to travel through the GI tract much more slowly and it's going to keep us fuller for longer, whereas a low fiber meal is absorbed immediately. As you can see by the little green bar, that low fiber meal has quite a high glycemic index, which means it causes blood glucose to rise really fast, whereas the high fiber meal has a much slower rise of that blood glucose, causing a little bit less hunger right away because you don't have those peaks and valleys of blood glucose spikes and blood glucose falls. So carbs and calorie intake, this is a big thing because we tend to think of carbs as being really high calorie foods. However, the butter that we put on the potato actually has twice as many calories per gram as the actual potato does. So often it's what we put on top of the carbohydrates that cause them to cause a little bit of weight gain. In addition, carbs aren't super filling by themselves unless we're consuming them with fiber. So eating the inside of a potato might leave you with a really high glycemic index food that's going to cause you to be really hungry a couple hours later. It's also really easy to drink our calories from carbs. And when we drink our calories, we don't get as full. So the intake of soda and things like that, there's about 100 to 150 calories per cup of soda. And that doesn't cause the same fullness factor as, say, 100 calories of yogurt or 100 calories of a piece of fruit. So when we look at that, it's going to possibly cause some weight gain due to hunger and satiety signals. There's a big debate about high fructose corn syrup, and I did put a couple of extra lectures on sugar, which have some great links to high fructose corn syrup controversy. When we look at this, you can see that sweetener intake has increased over time, but in the past few years, the high fructose corn syrup has gone down a bit with all of the, all the information about avoiding it. However, high fructose corn syrup actually looks quite similar to table sugar, almost exactly the same molecular formula. And high fructose corn syrup is just a really cheap additive that's been put in our food supply in such high quantities that have made us eat way too much added sugar. So we want to avoid all sources of added sugar, or at least reduce them. it's suggested that women have about 6 teaspoons a day of added sugar and men about 9 teaspoons a day of added sugar, whereas the average American has closer to 30. We also have non-nutritive sweeteners. So non-nutritive sweeteners have a number of pros and cons. As pros, they can decrease cavities because they don't have the same effect on cavity development as regular sugar does. They can also control blood sugar because they don't have a negative effect on increasing blood sugar really quickly. However, they are associated with weight gain. They're present in pretty low nutrient density foods, and each one of these seen below can be quite toxic at high doses. A specific type of fiber can help us reduce our cholesterol levels, and that is soluble fiber, which we talked a little bit about in terms of health claims. If you want to really understand how to do this, you need to understand how cholesterol is secreted into the small intestine. So bile is actually made of cholesterol. It's secreted into the small intestine after we consume fat. Soluble fiber with a meal will bind to that cholesterol and cause it to be excreted from the large intestines into the rectum and through the anal canal. However, with a low fiber meal, with a low meal not full of soluble fiber, that cholesterol just gets reabsorbed and reused, which can cause our cholesterol to go up over time. This is why we can make that health claim lowers cholesterol on a nutrient content or health claim. Diverticulosis is another disorder related to carbohydrates. It results in these little pockets in the large intestines called diverticula. These can become very painful and inflamed when exposed to fiber, so often people need to eat a pretty bland diet when they have diverticula to make that diverticulosis not turn into diverticulitis, or the inflammation of the large intestines. So how much carbohydrate do you eat? We tend to think of carbs as being the potatoes and the rice and the starchy foods, but carbs are in all of these products you see on this slide, almost in everything that we consume, except for meat and oil. So the RDA for carbs is 130 grams, and that is to prevent ketosis. The AMDR for carbs, which is the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, is going to be 45 to 65% of total calories. And the AI for fiber is 25 grams for women and 38 grams for men. So you can calculate on here that if somebody's total calories were 3,000, try to figure out if total carbs were 500 grams and fiber was 20 grams. Does this person meet the RDA and AMDR for carbs and the AI for fiber? Try it on your own and let me know if you have any questions. Again, if we have 240 grams of carbohydrate and 2,400 calories, what's the percentage of calories that come from carbs? Just a hint, we would need to convert the grams to calories in order to complete this project. So again, test this problem on your own and let me know if you have any questions. So thinking it through, looking at two cereal boxes, right? Our Raisin Bran and our multigrain cereal. If we're comparing products, we want to compare the fiber, we want to compare the sugar, we want to maybe compare the protein and the calories from fat. But in terms of carbs, we want to look for some added sugar sources on the ingredients list and compare the fiber, the sugar, and the total carb grams. So think about it. Which one of these cereals do you think you would choose in order to have the healthiest carbohydrates possible? And lastly, if we take a look at choosemyplate.gov, you want to make sure that your carbohydrate sources are coming from as little added sugar and refined carbs as possible, and as many whole grains, fresh fruits and veggies, and lean sources of fiber-rich proteins such as legumes and beans. So that is carbohydrates in a nutshell. Look forward to talking to you about fats next week. Study up and be ready for some great activities coming up the next couple weeks.